Hi, and welcome to PowerViews. I'm Dan McDade, your host and president of PointClear. On PowerViews, I have the opportunity to talk to some really interesting and knowledgeable experts who offer solutions to some of today's toughest marketing and sales challenges. My guest today is Nick Stein. Now with Salesforce, Nick is a results-driven marketer focused on generating and nurturing qualified leads by executing campaigns built around compelling content and thought leadership. Prior to his roles in marketing, Nick was a writer for Fortune magazine, an adjunct professor at New York University, and an award-winning investigative journalist for CBC television. Nick, welcome to PowerViews.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dan. Thanks.
Well, thank you. You're in Toronto, and you say it's warm up there, so none of the rest of us here in the States can be complaining, right?
Exactly. We even have our share of warm days every once in a while.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, when I was up there one time, it wasn't warm. I'll guarantee you. But it was in February, and it was plenty cold. So it's interesting because the series of questions we're going to talk about are as much about sales as they are marketing, and I'm sure there's a method to that. But mobile and social technologies have really radically transferred the way people buy, and how have they transformed the way people sell, or how have they affected the way people sell?
Well, it's a great question, Dan, and I think what it really comes down to is that consumers, as a result of these new technologies, are just so much better equipped than they ever were before. And in fact, there's some interesting research that came out recently from the guys at the CEB that showed that when a consumer picks up the phone to call a vendor for the first time, they're already 60% of the way through their buying decision. So what that means is that they're doing a lot of work before they ever reach out to us, and so that has fundamentally changed the way that we have to interact. And some of these new technologies give us the capability to kind of help educate our prospects and our customers while they're going through that buying process.
I know the Corporate Executive Board also did some research saying that 71% of buyers wanted sales reps involved earlier in the sales process. In fact, in the first and second phase versus the third and fourth phase. So there's a little bit of a combination going on there. Buyers are much more aware, much more sophisticated, but they also still are buying from people, and they still want help early in the process.
Exactly. I mean, I would say the business of sales is going through one of the most interesting phases that it's ever gone through as a result of these huge changes. I mean, a few quick numbers I'll throw at you. In the last 5 years, the average sales cycle has grown by 79%. So the amount of time that people are taking to make those decisions, and less than half of AEs are hitting their quotas these days. So a lot of people are struggling, and that leads to a lot of turnover among account executives, and it means that every time a new AE comes in, you need to be able to figure out a way to onboard them, which can take, on average 6 to 12 months. So you're losing all that productivity over that time, which ultimately, you could see companies spending about $1 million every time they lose a rep. So I think we're at a point where businesses are really struggling to figure out how it is they can kind of adapt to this new world that you're describing, a world very much defined by some of these technological changes that we're seeing.
Yeah. A friend of mine had a funny expression. 15 years ago, he said that if a rep responded to all the RFPs they got, that they made their budget or their forecast, and if they spell checked, they made club. Things have changed a lot, and one of the things that's happening, I think that you've talked about before, that there are a lot of younger people coming into the sales force, and they're different. How are they different, and how does that impact motivation and compensation issues with them?
Well, it's a very astute observation. I think that what's changed about young people is that they've grown up in this area of instantaneous real-time feedback. So they expect to kind of get answers immediately, and in particular to get feedback as a sales rep on how they're doing all the time. And that's a big shift for some of the managers who maybe are in a different generation, who kind of feel like, okay, I'm going to show you the ropes and then let you go off and and do this stuff on your own. And I think the biggest change that's happened is that sales forces are so much more distributed today, thanks to the internet, that you no longer have that sales world that you did 25 or 30 years ago, where everyone was in the same office and a manager could give their reps sort of that day-to-day coaching, that feedback in the moment that could help them improve and develop their skills. So you kind of have these two things converging, a group of people coming in desperate for that kind of feedback and attention, and then a group of managers who are not really accustomed to communicating with their people in that way.
So I guess that, and I know that this is all over the website with, instead of waiting for an annual evaluation, you're continuously communicating. And I know another interview that you gave, it was with Tibor Shanto, you talked about, how do you turn every sales rep into an A player? Would you say that companies can do that? Can companies turn every sales rep into an A player? Can they help with retention, by some of the things you've talked about?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I would say every rep into an A player. I think that the mistake that a lot of companies make, though, is that they focus all of their time, or the vast majority of their time, on the top performers and on the lowest performers, and the group in the middle that really constitutes 70-80% of your sales force, the ones who ultimately are responsible for whether you hit your revenue targets as a business or whether you miss them, they kind of get ignored. And there are a couple reasons for that. The main one is just that most managers in sales tend to get promoted because of the fact that they're great salespeople. And so they naturally kind of gravitate toward other great salespeople, and they want to hang out with their top reps, and they kind of just feel an affinity with those folks. At the same time, they spend a lot of time and effort trying to help the stragglers at the very bottom, who the reality is no amount of coaching or feedback is probably going to help. And what we found is that by focusing on the middle, those folks in the middle, and giving them just 10 minutes a day of focused coaching, a manager, that actually makes the difference between a rep hitting their quota and missing their quota. That 10 minutes has a 17% impact in positively on a rep's ability to hit their number every month.
Yeah, I had an old boss who I still think a lot of, and he said that you classify reps into the top, middle, and bottom, and you're constantly pushing up from the bottom, because basically the middle reps, the only thing they care about is not being on the bottom, and the only thing the top reps care about is staying on the top. So if you can just inch some of the middle up and inch some of the bottom up, it moves the whole process up. And I always thought that was an interesting, kind of a mental picture of how the process works.
Exactly. And I mean, I think what we're seeing is that's the biggest challenge that organizations face today is how do you scale that? Because a lot of them, every company has terrific managers who just instinctively know how to get the best out of their people. But the question is, how do you take those great behaviors, those behaviors that we know drive sales performance, and provide every rep, every manager within the organization with that kind of blueprint for success? And I think that's really the challenge that we're trying to solve at Salesforce. Is really, we want to provide sales organizations with the tools that they need so that they can turn as many of their reps as possible into A players.
I think that's a good transition to the next question, which is, and I've heard it referred to as both gamification and gamification. I don't know if the one's right or one's wrong, but there's an awful lot of talk about that in the industry today. Do you have some kind of tips or best practice suggestions that you can make to the audience about using that?
I do. I mean, it's a really interesting development. I mean, we normally refer to it as gamification because it's really bringing game dynamics into the workplace. Although, truthfully, I think games have always been in the workplace. If you think about it, leaderboards and even the employee of the month pasted up on the wall is a game. If you look at badges, which have become very popular recently. I mean, the Boy Scouts and the U.S. military had badging going on, for many, many, many decades. So I think what's often overlooked, or the biggest challenge, is how do you use or bring in those game elements to achieve the results you want to achieve? Because I think what sometimes happens is people get so caught up in the idea of, if we just bring in some leaderboards and start giving people points, magically everything will happen. They forget
ring some bells and blow some whistles.
Yeah, they forget about what behaviors they're really trying to promote. And in today's world, as we were talking about earlier, sales has become so much more complex that you need a lot more collaboration internally to get deals across the line. And so, one of the things we'll often see is a company will try and bring in some gamified elements to their sales organization, and they end up with people just competing with each other internally to get their name to the top of the leaderboard, as opposed to really incentivizing them to work together to drive more revenue, which is ultimately the goal, of the business. So yeah. I think that's the key thing that we've learned, is that how do you take those behaviors that you really want to promote, and then bring in some of these new technologies around gamification to achieve that end goal. And one example of how we've done it is we have this capability called Thanks. And what we've done is we've taken an activity that people, as old as workplaces and time itself, when someone does a great job, you thank them. And it gives that person an immediate feeling that they've helped you, and that recognition, which keeps them engaged and motivated. But what we've done is say, how can we actually turn that into a learning moment? So we make that thanks message public. It appears in the feed so that everyone in the company can see it, and we make it very specific. So you know instinctively that your rep has just been thanked because they were able to drive a sense of urgency into their deal and reach the executive decision maker more quickly, and that's what led to them closing that deal. So as a colleague, as someone else, you now understand, okay, this is what I need to do if I want to improve, if I want to close my next deal.
And that's a great segue again to the next question, which you've talked before about, sort of walking the tightrope of motivating salespeople, and I think probably a lot of that has to do with generational issues. But how do you walk that tightrope? What do you recommend? What do you see out there?
Well, I think the reality is everyone likes a pat on the back. Everyone likes to be acknowledged when they're doing a good job, and I think probably there's been a ton of great research out there. Probably one of the best known on this topic is Daniel Pink, who wrote his book Drive on what motivates us, and he did all this social science that actually showed that surprisingly it wasn't just money. Once you've hit a certain threshold where you're going to pay your bills and everything, what really motivates you is that intrinsic feeling that you've achieved mastery over a new task, or someone's recognized you for something that you've done. And so what we've really tried to do is figure out, how do we bring that intrinsic feeling of motivation into the workforce, into the sales force, that's kind of going to keep people engaged and keep them performing at the highest levels.
You obviously you work with arguably one of the most successful technology companies in the world, and we talk all the time about alignment between marketing and sales. I guess question is, how do you see sales roles adapting and integrating with marketing technology? I know when I was talking to Coco Sexton earlier today, he was saying, the way he kind of got into social media selling was just by, starting to use some of the tools out there and having some success. But obviously, it's a much more complicated world today than it was maybe 10 years ago. How do you see the world of technology kind of intersecting with the world of marketing and sales?
Well, it's a great question. I think it goes back to what we were discussing a little bit earlier about how sales has changed, how sales cycles are getting longer and consumers are looking for that education. And so that traditional handoff that used to happen where a marketer would say, here's your lead, Mr. Sales Guy, go run with it. Now it has to be much more of a partnership. It's got to be can you help me, equip me, Mr. Marketer, with the tools that I need so that I can continue to educate my prospect as he or she goes through that much more complicated selling decision. And then that doesn't end once the person's purchased the product, because you need to continue to maintain that relationship and do it through a lot of the tools that we now have available to us. So I think at the same time, sales can now reach out through LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook and connect with someone who they may then pass to marketing to help educate them and then pass back to sales. So there's this much more collaborative thing, I think, that's happening in the world out there today, where sales and marketing really have to work closely together if a company wants to be successful.
How do you see that? I mean, if you look out to 2015, and this is the kind of question that most people hate, but if you look out to 2015, how do you see that manifesting itself? What will things look like then as compared to now?
Well, I think what's happening, and we've already seen a lot of this today, is that the companies who are succeeding are the ones who can narrow the feedback gap internally and externally. So if you think about it, what it really comes down to is years ago, really a decade ago, companies started to look at their supply chains and they started to say, how can we get rid of these batch processes that are slowing us down and make a seamlessly integrated supply chain so that our products go immediately from the factory right to where they're needed in real time. I think what's happening now is companies are saying, how can we do that with information on our prospects, on our customers? How can we connect internally to one another so that sales and marketing and legal and IT and every other area of the business are completely aligned and in sync, so that when an issue comes up, we can move that much more quickly than our competitors. And then how can we connect externally with partners, with our customers, with our prospects, so that we can really help them with the buying decision early on, as opposed to just becoming a commodity where we don't hear from them until they're ready to make a decision, and then we can get cut out of the deal if we're 5 cents more expensive. Yeah.
Unfortunately, you see way too much of that. Nick, how can our audience get a hold of you if they have a follow-up question or just want to reach out and talk to you?
Well, I'll provide a link with you that folks can reach out to me. I work for a part of Salesforce called work.com, so anybody can just go to our website, and there's information there on our product, and we're always happy to share information about anything that we've talked about and other things as well.
Well, and I can tell the audience that if you Google Nick Stein at work.com or salesforce.com, there's plenty of activity out there, so you'll be able to find them pretty easily. Well, thank you so much for...
I'm on Twitter as well at Stein_Nick, so people can always reach out to me on Twitter as well.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you. Thank you again for joining me here today. I really appreciate your spending the time.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation again soon.
Well, that sounds good. Well, for now, this is Dan McDade signing off from another edition of PowerViews. Thank you for watching.